What are you willing to sacrifice for your safety? I know it's a strange question, but think about it for just a minute. If there was another major attack on the US, maybe 10 times worse than 9/11, how do you think our government and people might respond? Because 9/11 resulted in the death of nearly 3,000 people and ultimately led to the passing of the Patriot Act. And while some people voiced their concerns at the time about privacy, the vast majority of the population was on board, and it passed with overwhelming support. It was only later that we began to see the consequences of passing such legislation under the influence of fear. Now, imagine this: another attack happens on US soil by a foreign country. Maybe 5,000 people are killed, and the nation is absolutely terrified. Within a week, Congress passes the National Security Verification Act. And their argument is quite simple. We are a very diverse nation. There are far too many people from far too many countries, and we need to know who the threat is. So, tech companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon must share all of their user data with Homeland Security: real time tracking location, social media monitoring, purchasing history, search inquiries, everything. Their job is to monitor all the data coming from these companies to ensure that no person in the country is a suspicious actor. Essentially, a social credit system. But instead of calling it that, maybe we call it Patriot Verification. And if you don't think that this is possible, I would have to disagree, because most Americans would probably support it immediately following the attack, as long as it's within a certain time frame. Even Americans that value freedom and privacy would support the legislation because they are absolutely terrified. But the real question is why fear makes us give up our freedom. Why does fear make humans so irrational that we are willing to give up a piece of ourselves for protection? Well, two philosophers separated by over 300 years explain exactly how this works. So let's start in 1651. England is in a civil war. Bodies are in the streets and chaos is everywhere. And a philosopher named Thomas Hobbes is writing the most brutal description of human nature ever put to paper. Hobbes asks a simple question: what would life be like without the government? And his answer is not a good one. He claims that without government, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That you live in continual fear and the danger of violent death. He calls this the state of nature, where every person is always in fear of losing his life to another, and no one can ensure the long term satisfaction of their needs. And cooperation is impossible because everything operates on utter distrust. Now, think about what that means. You can't plant crops because someone might kill you before harvest. You can't build a house because someone might take it from you. You can't sleep because you might not wake up. You are constantly watching your back, constantly afraid and alone. For Hobbes, the fear of violent death is the summum malum, or the greatest evil. Avoiding it is the most fundamental human drive that we have. So, how do we escape this nightmare? Well, we have to make a deal. We surrender some of our freedom to a powerful authority, what Hobbes compares to the Leviathan. And in exchange, that authority protects us from the chaos. It enforces laws, punishes violence, and makes cooperation possible. This is the social contract, and we make this trade voluntarily because we are terrified of the alternative. People give their obedience as a free gift in their hope that their safety will be ensured. The sovereign receives obedience from the many because they believe that it will keep them safe. Hobbes was writing about an absolute monarchy, But the mechanism that he identified works for any government. When your government says that there's a threat, something primal activates on the inside. That same fear of violent death, the same desire for protection, whether it's terrorism, foreign invasion, crime waves, or pedophilia rings, the specific threat doesn't matter. What does matter is that you believe that your safety is at risk. When you're afraid, when that ancient fear of death actually kicks in, you'll make the trade without even thinking about it. Privacy for protection, freedom for security, and surveillance for safety. What we have to understand is that fear creates the permission structure. We give our freedom away because the alternative seems much worse. But the problem is, once we make that trade, we cannot get it back. Now, let's fast forward to 2001. Giorgio Agamben, an Italian philosopher, is watching America's response to 9/11. He recognizes a pattern that he has been studying for many years. Agamben has a concept called the state of exception. In an emergency, the sovereign can transcend normal law in the name of public order and survival. The state of exception nullifies legal protections through sovereign decision. It's different from a normal state of emergency because it is more politically significant. It essentially suspends the rule of law itself. The rules themselves stop applying because whatever happened is new and unheard of. So constitutional protections are suspended, and the executive can act outside of the law. But the consequences of this fear based shift can be devastatingly dangerous. Ingerman points to a historical example that you might not even know about. In February of 1933, the German parliament caught fire.
And President Hindenburg's own chair was also destroyed. Hitler, now Chancellor, has announced that the fire was the work of communists and was intended to be the signal for a Bolshevist uprising throughout the country. In consequence, Germany has been placed under a system of martial law, a decree having been signed which aims at the total destruction of communism.
Hindenburg issued the Reichstag Fire decree just one day later, which indefinitely suspended most of Weimar Republic's civil liberties. The decree suspended the right to assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and other constitutional protections, including all restraints on police investigations. And if getting rid of freedoms wasn't enough, the decree also permitted the regime to arrest and incarcerate political opponents without any specific charge, to dissolve political organizations, and to confiscate private property. It also gave the regime the authority to overrule state and local laws and overthrow state and local governments. Now, that was an extreme reaction to what happened, but it remained in effect until Nazi Germany was defeated in May of 1945. This single incident, fueled by political instability and a burning rage, led to the most devastating law ever passed. From the fire to the complete suspension of civil liberties, the emergency never ended. And 12 years later, 50 million people were dead. And this is not an isolated incident. Agamben argues that 2 months after 9/11, the Bush administration authorized an indefinite detention of non-citizens and warrantless surveillance. This unusual extension of power is a strategy that has the potential to transform democracies into totalitarian states. His warning is very clear. The generalization of the state of exception through laws like the Patriot Act mean a permanent installation of martial law and emergency powers. Rule by decree has become common since World War I in all modern states. While the original Patriot Act and many of its provisions expired, Its legacy lives on through successor legislation like the USA Freedom Act and ongoing Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, meaning many of the enhanced surveillance capabilities remain part of the U.S. national security law. So, why does it never go away? Well, it's because of the ratchet effect. Each president's use of emergency power sets a new, marginally lower threshold for its use by subsequent administrations. The extraordinary becomes the standard. Powers invoked during a crisis have a staying power, leading to permanent expansion of state authority. A ratchet only turns one direction, and it only ever gets tighter, but it never loosens. Each successive crisis creates opportunities for governments to consolidate their powers, often under the guise of protecting citizens. Emergency measures metastasize into permanent restrictions on freedom. When you understand both Hobbes and Angevin, you can see the complete mechanism for how free societies give up their freedom. And it all starts with fear. Create or exploit a real or perceived threat. What matters is activating that primal fear of violent death, terrorism, foreign invasion, widespread violence. This is Hobbes' mechanism. Because fear makes the trade seem rational. And then comes the offer. We can protect you, but you need to give us these powers, just temporarily, so we can help with the emergency. The government presents itself as the protector that can save you from the chaos. And people accept. They voluntarily surrender privacy for security. The permission structure is built on fear. But the social contract is rewritten in the moment of crisis. And people consent because the fear of violent death overwhelms all other considerations. 20 years later, you're still living in a semi-surveillance state. You gave permission at every step, and it was all voluntary for your safety. And because you consented, because you made Hobbes trade freely in a moment of fear, you have no grounds to object when the emergency powers remain long after the emergency has passed. And all we need now is the next big crisis. Another attack, another cyber attack, a pandemic with political dimensions, something that makes 9/11 and COVID look manageable. And when that happens, someone will make this argument. We need to know who the threats are because we are a diverse nation. We need real-time verification, and tech companies hold that data. And you'll probably support it. Not because you're a bad person, not because you don't value your privacy and freedoms, but because you will be terrified for yourself and your family. Because Hobbes was right about what fear does to us. The trade will seem rational at the moment. Your fear of violent death and your desire for protection will override your commitment to privacy and civil liberties. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be afraid of real threats, because terrorism is real and even cybersecurity matters. Some surveillance might be legitimate, but we do need to understand the mechanism that we are vulnerable to. Because fear bypasses reason, and when we're terrified, we make trades that we would not otherwise make. Hobbes identified this over 300 years ago, and it remains true today. The fear of death is so powerful that it can overwhelm our commitment to freedom, our skepticism of authority, and even our understanding of history. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. And be sure to stay tuned this week because fear is not the only mechanism for manipulating an entire nation. In just a few days, we will look at another means of control: pleasure. So, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see y'all next time.